Have you ever carried something so heavy it made your chest tighten? A weight you couldn't see, but you felt it every moment, everywhere you went. A memory, a wound, a face you wish you could forget, a word you wish had never been spoken. Some burdens don't show on the outside, but inside they gnaw at us. Silent, relentless. The truth is we've all been hurt, betrayed, disappointed, by friends we trusted, lovers we adored, even family we thought would never fail us. And when the wound runs deep, forgiveness feels impossible. You tell yourself, I'm fine, I moved on. But did you? Because every time their name comes up, your heart tightens. Every time a memory resurfaces, your stomach knots. And somewhere inside, a quiet voice whispers, why should I forgive them? They don't deserve it. It's human to feel this way, to cling to our pain as if letting go means they win, as if releasing our anger means betraying ourselves. But here's the thing, the one suffering the most is not them, it's you. The Buddha compared holding onto anger to grasping a burning coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. But you're the one getting burned. So why do we struggle to forgive? Why does it feel safer to cradle our wounds than to let them heal? The answer lies in the nature of the mind and the tangled roots of human suffering. Our minds are wired for self-protection. When someone hurts us, we instinctively build walls. We armor ourselves with anger, resentment, and the illusion of control. It feels powerful to replay the betrayal in our heads, to imagine what we should have said, to picture them regretting what they did. But this power is a trap. In Buddhist philosophy, this is what we call upadana, clinging, attachment. Not just to people or possessions, but to emotions, stories, and identities. I am the victim. They are the enemy. These labels become the chains that bind us to suffering. And yet, forgiveness isn't about excusing their actions. It's not pretending it didn't hurt. It's not forgetting. Forgiveness, in its deepest sense, is about freedom. It's the act of saying, I will not let this pain define me anymore. I refuse to let your actions chain my heart. I choose peace over bitterness. But make no mistake, it's not easy. The ego resists. It feeds on grudges because to forgive is to admit that we are vulnerable, that we bleed. And vulnerability terrifies us. Even so, the path of forgiveness is not about weakness. It's about unimaginable strength. The strength to carry your own suffering with wisdom. The strength to see beyond the surface of someone's cruelty, to recognize the storm of ignorance, fear, and karma behind their actions. The Buddha taught that those who harm others are themselves prisoners of delusion, of greed, of hatred. They are caught in a storm of their own making, and until they awaken, they will continue to hurt, not only others, but themselves. You see, in this vast web of existence, we are all bound by our karma, the causes and conditions set in motion by our actions, words, and even thoughts. When we refuse to forgive, we trap ourselves in the same cycle of suffering, lifetime after lifetime. And yet, when one person chooses to let go, to step off the wheel of anger and retaliation, something extraordinary happens. A chain breaks, a ripple of peace spreads. And the world, even if only in that one heart, becomes a little lighter. I once met a woman, let's call her Mai. Her brother was killed in a senseless act of violence. The man responsible showed no remorse. Years passed, but Mai carried the wound like a stone in her chest. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't love. She spoke of the man with venom, believing that as long as she hated him, she was honoring her brother's memory. But hate doesn't honor the dead. It poisons the living. It wasn't until Mai began sitting with a Buddhist monk, learning about the nature of suffering, impermanence, and the futility of clinging, that she understood. Forgiveness wasn't about the man. It was about reclaiming her own life. I watched her transform. The lines in her face softened. Her voice grew calm. And for the first time in years, she smiled. This is the power of forgiveness. Not a gift to the one who hurt you, but a liberation for your own soul. So as we begin this journey together, I invite you to reflect. Who have you been carrying in your heart like a stone? What memory, what word, what wound still tugs at you in the quiet hours of the night? Because the path we're about to walk isn't about pretending those wounds didn't exist. It's about turning toward them, understanding them, and then laying them down, not for their sake, for yours, ready to begin. We think we know what hurts us. It's the harsh word, the betrayal, the broken promise, the unexpected goodbye. We carry these wounds like medals of survival, proof that we've endured life's cruelty. But if you pause, truly pause, and peer beneath the surface of those wounds, you'll discover something unexpected. It's not the action itself that hurts us most. It's what our mind does with it afterward. A man insults you. For a moment there's a sting, sure. But then, hours later, days, weeks, your mind clings to it, turns it over like a stone in your hand, polishes it, adds stories to it. He disrespected me. I don't deserve that. But people always take advantage of me. Now the wound isn't just his words, it's the castle of suffering you built around them. The Buddha taught that pain and suffering are not the same thing. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Pain is the moment your heart breaks. Suffering is replaying it in your mind 1,000 times. Pain is what happens. Suffering is the story we tell ourselves about what happened. And we humans, we are natural storytellers. We assign meaning to everything. He betrayed me, therefore I'm unlovable. They left me, so I'll always be alone. But what if the hurt isn't in the event, but in the meaning we attach to it? What if we suffer not because of what they did, but because of what we believe it says about us? There's a Buddhist teaching about the two arrows. Imagine you're walking through the forest and an arrow strikes you. That's the first arrow, life's inevitable pain. But then, you pick up another arrow and stab yourself again and again with your own thoughts, anger, and resentment. The first arrow we cannot always control, but the second, that one, we fire ourselves. So often, it's not just the act that hurts us, it's the way we hold on to it, the way we make it personal, the way we believe it defines our worth. I've seen this countless times in people seeking peace. A man whose father left him when he was 10. He wasn't just grieving the absence, he carried the belief. I wasn't good enough to stay for. A woman whose friend betrayed her confidence. She wasn't just angry at her friend, she carried the thought. People can't be trusted. We live out these beliefs like unspoken vows, shaping our relationships, our futures, our sense of self. And unless we recognize them, we stay trapped in a cycle of hurt, long after the original wound has healed. But here's the beauty. The hurt isn't fixed, the meaning isn't permanent, and the story can be rewritten. Because while we cannot always control what happens to us, we have the power to choose how we relate to it. And in that choice is freedom. The Buddha said, "You are your own refuge." Meaning, your liberation doesn't come from the world changing. It comes from how you see the world, from how you choose to hold your pain, from whether you cradle it like a precious relic or gently place it down and step forward lighter. So let's ask the deeper question. When someone hurt you, what did you begin believing about yourself? What invisible vow did you make that still shapes your life today? Because if you can trace the pain back not just to the event, but to the meaning you attached to it, you begin to see the illusion for what it is. It wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't the insult. It wasn't the leaving. It was the story you told yourself afterward. And that story can be rewritten. In the next breath, in the next step, we begin untangling those stories. We begin asking, is this belief true? Must I carry this? Can I see this differently? This is how the journey toward forgiveness quietly begins, not with some grand declaration of release, but with a soft, brave decision to question the narratives we've lived by. And in that questioning, a crack forms in the walls of our suffering. A sliver of light enters, and the heart, heavy for so long, begins to remember what it feels like to breathe. And now, let's gently follow that light. Have you ever carried a stone in your hand for hours? At first, it seems light, barely noticeable. But as time passes, your fingers ache, your palm grows numb, your arm tires. Now imagine carrying that stone, not in your hand, but in your heart. This is what anger does to us. We believe anger punishes the one who hurt us. that somehow by clinging to resentment we hold them accountable. But in truth, it's like drinking poison and hoping they fall ill. The Buddha described anger as a fire. It rises quickly, devours everything in its path, and leaves nothing but ash. But what most of us don't realize is that we often build the pyre ourselves. Someone insults you, the anger flares, but instead of letting it burn out, you feed it. How dare they? I'll show them. They'll regret this. Every thought another twig on the fire, and long after the other person has moved on, you're left alone in the smoke and ruins, still clutching your anger like a relic. Why do we do this? Why do we hold on to something that hurts us? Because anger for a fleeting moment feels powerful. It gives us a sense of control when we've been made to feel powerless. It distracts us from our pain with the heat of indignation. It tells us, if I stay angry, I won't feel the grief. If I stay angry, they can't hurt me again. But what it actually does is chain us to the very people and moments we most wish to escape. The Buddha said, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. I've seen this in so many lives. The woman who carries resentment for a mother that abandoned her decades ago. The man who clings to rage over a business betrayal that happened in his youth. The friend who nurses old wounds from a love that turned to ashes. And every time, it's not the memory that destroys them. It's the anger, because anger calcifies, it hardens the heart, it narrows the world. You begin to trust less, love less, hope less, and what's left is a life reduced to shadows because the fire that once raged now leaves only coldness behind. But here's the truth. Anger is not strength. Forgiveness is. It takes far greater courage to release the weight of resentment than to carry it. Anger tells you, if I let this go, they win. But in reality, the moment you release it, you win. You win your peace. You win your freedom. You reclaim your life. And this is the path Buddhism offers us. Not to deny anger, not to shame it, but to understand it, to see it arise, to witness its heat, and then to let it pass like a storm across the sky. Because storms always pass. The Tibetan master Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche once said, anger is like a spark. If you act on it, you may burn down 100 acres of forest. But if you let it be, it will quickly fade away. So today, ask yourself, what old fire still smolders in me? What anger am I nursing, hoping it will somehow make them suffer but only burns me instead? And most importantly, am I ready to put it down? Because every time you do, you become lighter. Your heart expands. The world feels larger, more forgiving, more alive. And in that space, in that openness, something miraculous happens. You no longer feel bound to the past. You no longer define yourself by what was done to you. You become something freer, fuller, braver. And this is where the roots of forgiveness quietly begin to grow. Now, as we continue this journey, a question softly arises. If anger chains us to suffering, what is it we must choose in its place? What is the doorway through which peace enters when anger leaves? The answer waits patiently ahead. There's a story from ancient India. A man was struck in the chest by an arrow. As he lay bleeding, his friends rushed to pull it out. But the man, gasping in pain, protested, "Wait, before you remove it, tell me, who shot this arrow? What is his caste? What is his family name? What kind of wood is this arrow made from?" And as he demanded answers, he died. The Buddha shared this tale to remind us of a truth we so often forget. When we are hurt, our mind fixates on the wrong questions. Who did this to me? Why would they? How could they? And in chasing those answers, we lose what matters most, our peace. Compassion in the Buddhist sense isn't about excusing harm. It isn't about pretending wounds don't exist. It's about seeing beyond the act to the suffering behind it. Because no one harms another from a place of wholeness. Every cruelty, every betrayal, every word meant to wound is a reflection of an inner war. The person who lies to you may be drowning in shame. The one who betrays you may be desperate to escape their own emptiness. The one who lashes out may have known nothing but violence their entire life. This isn't to excuse the harm, but to understand its source. The Buddha taught that all beings are driven by causes and conditions. No one acts in isolation. We are shaped by our upbringing, our fears, our wounds, our ignorance. When you see someone's anger, you're seeing centuries of inherited pain. When you encounter cruelty, you're witnessing the consequence of lives lived in suffering. And suddenly, the person who hurt you is no longer a monster. They are a mirror, a reflection of what any one of us might become if lost enough, afraid enough, broken enough. Thich Nh letter 1ea5t, H letter 1ea1nh once said, "When another person makes you suffer, it is because he suffers deeply within himself, and his suffering is spilling over." What would it mean if instead of reacting with hate, you responded with compassion, not for their sake, but for your own freedom? Because hatred binds, compassion liberates. And here's a secret: you don't have to like them. You don't have to approve of what they did. You don't even have to see them again. But you can choose not to carry the poison of anger in your heart. You can say, "I see your pain. I see that your actions came from a place of ignorance and suffering. And though it wounded me, I refuse to let it define me." This is compassion in action, not abstract philosophy, not saintly perfection, but a radical act of reclaiming your peace. When you do this, you don't just release them, you release yourself. You stop chasing answers to questions that only prolong your pain. You stop being the man dying from the arrow, obsessed with who shot it. You focus instead on healing, on pulling out the arrow, on closing the wound, on walking forward lighter, freer, clearer. And in time, perhaps you even realize that those who hurt you were teachers in disguise. Unwilling, unconscious teachers, but teachers nonetheless. They taught you where your boundaries are. They showed you the depth of your resilience. They revealed how much more you value peace than pride. So ask yourself now, who in my life have I refused to see beyond their offense? Who have I imprisoned in the story of what they did, without ever glimpsing what made them that way? And most importantly, am I ready to set myself free from that story? Because forgiveness is not a gift you give to the offender. It's a gift you give to yourself. And through compassion, not as sentiment but as clear-sighted wisdom, you reclaim your life from the grip of old wounds. There is a deeper practice still. If we can look beyond their offense, if we can recognize their suffering, can we extend to them a sincere wish for their healing, not because they deserve it, but because we do. Because the weight we carry lightens each time we wish another being well. And in this space, where anger once smoldered, compassion blooms. Somewhere ahead, we'll learn how to gently untie the knots of our past, to let go not by forgetting, but by releasing the story itself. And the first thread we pull begins here. We carry so much, invisible burdens slung over our shoulders, stories we tell ourselves about what happened, what should have been, what they did. And though the past is gone, its shadow follows us. Not because it refuses to leave, but because we refuse to release it. We hold tight to our pain like a relic, believing that if we let it go, it somehow means it didn't matter. But here's a truth few dare to whisper. Letting go isn't forgetting. It's choosing peace over proof. The Buddha often spoke of suffering as a fire, and our memories, our resentments, our need to be right, these are the logs we keep throwing onto that fire. The practice of letting go is the practice of no longer feeding the flames. But how do we begin? How do you set down a weight you've carried so long you no longer know who you are without it? It starts with awareness. To see the story you've been telling yourself. To notice how you replay that scene, that conversation, those words like a film on repeat. And then to ask with quiet courage, does this serve me? Not is it fair? Not are they sorry? Not do I deserve justice, but simply does this serve my freedom, my healing, my peace? If the answer is no, the practice begins. In Buddhist thought, clinging is the root of suffering. And clinging to the past is like holding a burning coal, intending to throw it at another, but you're the one being scorched. So we learn to release, not all at once, not through grand declarations, but in small, intentional moments. A breath, a prayer, a whispered, "I release this." And when the memory returns, as it will, you meet it not with anger but with compassion. "Ah, you again. I see you, but you no longer control me." You give yourself permission to set it down, over and over, until one day you notice the burden is no longer there. And letting go doesn't mean what happened was okay. It doesn't mean you weren't hurt. It doesn't mean justice is irrelevant. It means you value your peace more than your pain. It means you refuse to build a home in the ruins of your own suffering. It means you're choosing to live in this moment, instead of a past you cannot rewrite. There's a meditation practice in many Buddhist traditions called metta, or loving-kindness meditation. You begin by offering goodwill to yourself. May I be well. May I be safe. May I be at peace. Then you extend it to those you love. Then to those you're indifferent to. And finally to those who have harmed you. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve to be free. Because the bitterness you hold binds only you. And when you can genuinely wish even your enemy well, when you can say, "May you find peace, may you awaken from your suffering," something extraordinary happens. The chains loosen, the heart softens, and the weight you carried for years begins to dissolve. This is not weakness. This is not surrender. This is the fiercest kind of courage. To look directly at your pain, to honor it, and then to say, "I no longer need to carry this." To understand that forgiveness and letting go are not acts you do for them. They are sacred acts of self-liberation. Think now of what you've carried, the betrayals, the words that stung, the moments you still wake up remembering. And ask yourself, am I ready? If you are, whisper it. If you're not, that's okay too. The path of letting go is not a finish line. It's a daily practice, a choice made not once but 1,000 times. And each time you choose peace, you take another step toward your own awakening. Ahead lies something even deeper, a way not just to let go, but to transform your wounds into wisdom, to turn your deepest pain into the very ground from which compassion and clarity can grow. And it begins where we least expect it. Somewhere along the way, we were taught to fear pain, to see it as an enemy, an intruder we must expel as quickly as possible. But pain was never the enemy, it was the messenger. And like any messenger, it comes bearing a truth we're meant to face. A truth about ourselves, about the world, about the nature of attachment and impermanence. We cannot escape being hurt, not in this life, not in any life. But what we can do is decide what to do with the hurt. The great Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "No mud, no lotus." Without the thick, dark mud of suffering, the radiant lotus cannot bloom. It is through the struggle, the heartbreak, the moments we thought we wouldn't survive that the deepest wisdom takes root. Not because the pain was noble, not because suffering is romantic, but because it's real. And in its rawness, it softens the heart, sharpens the mind, and humbles the ego. So how do we transform our wounds into wisdom? We begin by no longer denying them. We stop pretending we weren't hurt. We stop numbing, avoiding, blaming. We turn toward the pain, not away from it. In Buddhist teachings, this is called mindful awareness. To observe our suffering not with judgment, but with curiosity. To ask not why me, but what is this here to teach me? And almost always, it teaches us about attachment, about expectations unmet, about illusions we mistook for permanence. When we sit with our pain, truly sit with it, it begins to unravel. It reveals the unmet needs beneath the anger, the old wounds beneath the new betrayal, the loneliness masked by rage. And in those moments, we touch something ancient, the shared human ache we all carry. Suddenly, it's no longer just my pain. It's the pain, the same grief countless hearts before us have endured, the same longing for peace, the same hunger to be seen, understood, loved. And in that recognition, we awaken compassion. First for ourselves. It's okay that I hurt. It's okay that I struggle. I am human like everyone else. And then for others, even those who wounded us. We realize they too act from their wounds. They too are caught in cycles of ignorance, fear, and craving. And while this doesn't excuse harm, it explains it. It reminds us that suffering is a chain, and someone must be brave enough to break it. That bravery can be yours, because every time you choose to grow instead of harden, to learn instead of collapse, to forgive instead of retaliate, you transform that wound. It becomes not a scar you hide, but a mark of wisdom you carry. You become a little less reactive, a little more kind, a little wiser, softer, freer. And one day you'll find yourself comforting a friend or a stranger, saying words you once needed to hear. And in that moment, your old pain will have become a gift. Buddhism teaches that life is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but better understood as unsatisfactoriness, a pervasive instability of all things. And within that instability lies the opportunity for awakening. Your pain is not a detour from the path. It is the path. Every heartbreak, every loss, every betrayal, a chance to deepen your understanding of impermanence, of attachment, of compassion, to become not harder but wiser, to learn what truly matters and what never did. The old you will not survive this journey, but something better will, a you less bound by fear, less clung to the past, more anchored in the present, more open to life as it is, not as you wish it to be. And from that place, forgiveness is no longer a task. It's a natural flowering of a heart that no longer needs to cling, a quiet, gentle "I release you," not for their sake, but for your own, because wisdom has taught you. The lotus blooms only from the mud, and you, even with your wounds, are meant to bloom. Now, let's journey toward home, to the place where forgiveness no longer feels like effort but grace, a quiet act of freedom and an offering to the world. And now we arrive, not at the end of the path, but at a clearing in the woods, a quiet place inside ourselves where the weight we've carried for so long finally begins to fall away. It turns out, forgiveness was never about them. It was about us. It was about no longer allowing the past to steal our present, no longer letting someone's mistake define our story, no longer feeding the fire that scorches our own heart. You see, the Buddha taught that clinging to anger is like holding a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. But all the while, it's your hand that's burning. And we do this, don't we? We hold on to that anger. We rehearse the pain. We tell ourselves stories of injustice. We believe if we let go, we lose something, our dignity, our right to be hurt, our identity as the wronged. But what we lose is only our suffering. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It isn't forgetting. It isn't excusing what was done. It's choosing your freedom over your pain, your peace over your pride, your life over your history. And when you forgive, truly forgive, something remarkable happens. You free them from your mind, from your endless judgments, from the cage you built for them in your heart. And in doing so, you free yourself, because both of you were trapped in that same prison. When you finally say, "I release you," whether out loud in meditation or in your heart, it doesn't erase the past. It simply says, "I will not carry this into my future." And from that place of release, you'll notice something. The world feels a little softer, your chest a little lighter, your breath a little deeper. You'll laugh again. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer waiting for it to be. You'll understand, perhaps for the first time, that the people who hurt you were never as powerful as you believed, and that your peace was always within your reach, waiting patiently for you to claim it. Forgiveness is not a single act, it's a practice. Some days easy, some days impossible, but every time you choose it, you reclaim a piece of your soul. You remind yourself of who you are beneath the scars, not a victim, not a prisoner, but a witness to life's endless unfolding. And in that witnessing, wisdom grows, compassion deepens, and the heart, once shattered, becomes vast enough to hold all things: joy and sorrow, betrayal and grace. This is the gift of forgiveness. It frees both them and us. It turns pain into wisdom, wounds into light, and endings into new beginnings. If this journey touched you, even in a small way, I invite you to walk a little further with us. Subscribe to this channel, Zen Buddhism Wisdom, and be part of a community that chooses peace over bitterness, light over darkness, and understanding over judgment. Leave a comment below, share your story, your struggle, your small victories. Because you never know, your words might be the light someone else was waiting for in their darkest night. And remember, no mud, no lotus, no wound, no wisdom. Thank you for walking this path with me. Until we meet again, may you be well, may you be peaceful, may you be free.